All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Bloomerang Academy. I am your instructor, Ron Newlin, and today we're going to be talking about using Bloomerang for grant tracking. We're going to be talking about specifically a set of, mostly a set of custom fields that we recommend that you set up under the notes section of custom fields. And then some special reports that will allow you to know exactly where you are with each of the multiple steps that are involved in the process of researching, getting permission to apply for, applying for, and then reporting on competitive grants, largely from private foundations. Often this will also work for government agencies. This is me. And I am your instructor. I'm Ron Newlin at Bloomerang.co. I share that email with you for a couple of reasons. I've got questions after today's specific to today's topic. Feel free to follow up with me that way. So what we're going to do today, 5-point agenda. As I mentioned, I'm going to be talking about creating a couple of settings and a series of custom fields that we recommend that you set up in the notes section. So if you are a relatively new Bloomerang customer, you're probably getting used to creating custom constituent fields and maybe custom transaction fields. Custom note fields may be a new area for you, but you'll see they work just the same way. And before we're done here, we'll see why putting them in notes instead of transactions or custom fields is or constituents is going to be so useful for us today. I'm going to create a couple, well actually it says a basic report, a couple different ways for looking for the grants that you've already received. If you're taking this class, you're probably getting ready to start keeping track of your grants in a more detailed way than you've done in the past, which means that system isn't in place yet. So you really can't use what I'm going to teach you today to find your old stuff. What we're going to do today is, quickly here what we're going to do in a few minutes is look at a couple of ways to find existing grants in your database. So you know before you start our new processes that we're talking today, what your grant receiving history is. It's going to take just a minute to look out of Bloomerang onto the internet at a couple of resources for grant research. And mostly what we're going to do today, the biggest portion of today's session, is going to be to add a set of sample prospects. Then we're going to go through the imaginary process of researching, applying for, receiving grants from those prospects, how to enter each of those things into Bloomerang, both into the custom notes section on that individual funder while during the process, and then once you receive the grant, how to how we recommend using transactions to keep track of where you are in the process of receiving. Because most grants these days, very rarely do you get the entire amount of grant in one swell foop, as they say. So you're probably going to want to set your grants once you receive them up, not as donations, but as pledges. That's point 5. And like I said, I think we can probably get through this a little bit less than an hour, and you can all be off for your next appointments unless you want to stick around, and I'll stick around with you. And then at the end, I will say, have fun storming the castle. Let's get into Bloomerang. This is my Bloomerang sample database. You'll recognize this looks like what you open up with your database every time you open, or your dashboard. These are my imaginary numbers based on all my imaginary work. And what we want to start with recommending today is that, one of the first things you may want to do would be to have under custom settings, under custom constituent settings, you may want to have a way of keeping track of your within a category called general information, where you would keep things like board membership and what college people went to and what committees they served on, things like that. You may want to have, in Bloomerang, every constituent is either an organization or a household, or it's either an individual or a household, or it's an organization. You may want to add an additional custom field specifically for organizations that are foundations, as opposed to businesses, churches, government agencies, community foundations. So this might be, if you've got a really large database with thousands of records, including hundreds and hundreds of organizations, you may want to be able to filter your report down to grant-making organizations by creating a custom constituent field called organization type, for which foundation or even just grant-making organization is the value. But mostly what I'm really going to recommend that we're going to do today is we're going to go not just into custom constituent fields, but we're going to recommend that you keep, we're going to set you up so that you can keep a history of every interaction that you have with a foundation, with a grant-making agency, within a single note. So as an example here, let me log in, let me open up just a demonstration of what I'm talking about. You know, let's open up a constituent. Let's look at the all right, we're going to do a rock and roll thing today. I'm going to look at my Mick Jagger Foundation. Now, normally in the course of dealing with any constituent over the course of a year, you're going to want to keep track on their timeline of the individual interactions that you have with them. In fact, maybe using a foundation isn't the best thing to do here. Let's just kind of look up an individual. Let's look up my buddy Dan Cooper. So you may be keeping a record here of every time you see the icon here of the talk bubble, that means you had an interaction with that consultant. And some of them are just simply a record that you've sent them a piece of mail on that day. Bloomerang is always going to create an interaction on the timeline every time you generate a mailing or a email out of Bloomerang to that person. Or you might manually want to go and create a new interaction to say that you had a face-to-face meeting, a breakfast meeting, the purpose of which was impact and cultivation, and the channel of which was in person. Today, he invited Dan to join the finance committee. That's what you do for keeping track of your face-to-face conversations with the vast majority of your constituents. But when we're talking about granting organizations, where in the course of applying for a grant, receiving the grant, reporting on the grant, you might have a dozen or more different points of contact overlapping several different grants. This could get really confusing on your timeline. And that's why what we're going to recommend that rather than a separate, for two different reasons, rather than a separate interaction for every touch that you have with every granting organization, we're going to recommend that you create a unique timeline note. So you go up to the upper right-hand corner, and instead of saying new interaction, you'd say new note for each grant that you are looking at. And within that note, you may be recording 5, 6, 8, 10 different touches with that vendor. So here's how we're going to go about doing that. I'm going to go down to settings. I'm going to open up custom fields. I'm going to open up custom note fields. One of the things you may or may not have known about Bloomerang yet is that when you create custom fields, either under notes or interactions or transactions or constituents, you're first invited to create a category, and then within that category, multiple fields. What we're seeing at the top here is prospect management info, because we also recommend the same process for the multiple steps that go into asking for a major gift, a 5- or 6-figure gift from a major prospective donor, where you're going to want to keep, it's the same way, keep track of all of your interactions with this donor over the course of several months that you kind of work your way toward asking them for a significant gift. We're going to recommend that you also, however, in addition to, well, and maybe you're starting with grant fields, you haven't gotten to this yet, I've got grant fields down here. Important thing to know about Bloomerang, these can all be dragged and dropped. So I'm going to grab, since we're going to be talking today about grant fields, I want this at the top of my page. And by moving it up here on this page, it's also going to be moving it up on each individual's record. Every time you rearrange your settings, the page in Bloomerang on the donor's record, where this shows up, also updates to report in the same way. So what we recommend is that once you've created a category called Grant Fields, then you create a series of custom fields within that category. And the first one we recommend is one we call Grant Status. When you create, real quickly here, rather than opening it up, let me show what it looks like if we were to create a new one. If we were to create a new one from scratch, just so you want to see what it looks like. Oh, that was a cat. Hold on. I didn't mean that as a category. I meant that as a new field within this. So when you're creating this from scratch, you are asked what kind of data goes in this field. This is where you want to say text. And then you're asked, how do you want to enter data in this field? And your three choices are type it in, or create a menu from which everything can only be one value, or create a menu from which it could be multiple values. For this particular field, what you want is one value from a list. We're going to create a list of the different steps that each grant can be in, and we want each grant to have one and only one possible answer to this question. So we would click this and save it. I'm not going to save it because I don't really want to clutter this database up any more than it already is. But I just wanted to show you how you create this if you hadn't seen it before. So now we're going to take a look at this. Within Grant Status, then, you're able to use the New Value button and create every different step of the process that you would like to be at. And then once you've created them, you can drag and drop them into whatever order you want. Same as before. So the 6 values that I've currently got is that if I'm in the process of getting ready to do some grant writing, first I want to say I'm actually not yet sure if this is a good fund. This is a likely funder, at least for this project. I'm doing my research, trying to figure out how much to ask for. Then I'm what many grant agencies call a letter of intent. Fewer and fewer funders these days just say, sure, just send us an application. Most of them want you to inquire with them, and maybe it's a letter, maybe it's a phone call. But this is the next step would be to find out if you can apply, and the step of that after that would be that they have said yes, at which point you've got a deadline to pursue. The next step would be actually meeting that deadline and submitting the proposal, and then you know that you either got some or all of the grant or you got none of it. And these are to be the 6 different steps that I would consider that any grant might be in. And you might have some additional interim steps in that you would want to enter, and you certainly can. Next thing I would recommend then would be go back to our list of note settings. Grant ask amount. At some point, probably maybe before or certainly after permission to submit, you're going to want to have a custom field for how much are you going to ask for in this grant. And it's going to be the type's currency, and it's going to be type it in. You'll want to keep track of a deadline for the proposal, the date at which you've been told you can expect to hear for it, grant award amount, which is, unfortunately, often not the same as grant ask amount. Sometimes it is. That's great. You're probably, at the time you receive a grant, if you receive it, you're going to be told that you've got a final report in the future, maybe an interim progress report in the meantime, and you want a custom field for each of these things. I've got a few other things here that I have deactivated. Anytime you enter, sometimes you'll create a custom field and then you realize, I don't really need to both keep track of my deadline and the date that it was submitted. I either got it submitted on time or I didn't. I don't need to put myself in the position of having to keep track of both of those things. So I created this one and then I deactivated it. So these are the custom fields that we're going to be using in a minute. Before we get into starting to use them, though, I also told you I wanted to run a couple reports. I want to see what you may have in your backlog of grants from the past. And so, I mean, obviously, maybe if you're taking this class to learn how your organization is already using this process, then you may already have notes about grants in Bloomerang. So you would go to your reports, you would create a new report. This report would be from scratch. And we want to see not a list of constituents, not a list of transactions. We want to see a list of notes that are specific to particular grants. So I want to see any note. And what I'm going to get here is a list of all 70 notes that are in, all 70 timeline notes in Bloomerang with the date of them. Some of these are in the future. Because that's actually how we recommend that you keep track of planned gifts, but that's not going to affect us today. So what you would probably want to do here is say I want to see those notes that have a grant status of any grant status. So this is going to eliminate any of those notes that had nothing to do with grants. We went from 70 to 20, and here is a list in reverse chronological order of every timeline note in Bloomerang that is related to a grant, where you can see over here what we're going to be able to see is we're going to start seeing within that grant note a series of dates where you're keeping track of everything that's happened, and you can see it all in one place rather than having to scroll up and down looking for different timeline notes. Or you can even get a little bit further. Let's say I want to see only those grants that have been awarded already. And here's the 10 grants that are in your database, at least those that have been, since your database has been using Bloomerang the way that we recommend. And here are your 10 received grants. And you can add columns here for instance, grant award amount. Now there you'll see, I've not necessarily always kept everything perfectly up to date, but they're in pretty good shape here. You can see the amount that was awarded for each of the grants that are already in Bloomerang at the time you inherited this process. What, though, if you are watching this class because you're just now getting ready to implement this process and you don't really have this type of record in Bloomerang yet? Well, let's look at a couple of other things we could do. We could also look to see, now this isn't going to tell you, if you've not been using this process, you may or may not have a good record in Bloomerang of grants that you've applied for and not received, but you should be able to get a list, a report from scratch of transactions that at least shows you what grants you have received. So a transaction report with no filters is every transaction in your database. I hope that you have, your organization has a separate appeal for grants. And if they do, there's a list. See, I've got 17 transactions in my database that have the transaction of grant. Some of them, because they're in reverse chronological order, if I scroll back through them, we'll see we get back far enough to where they were predating my dates, my notes field. But at least this will tell me, this is a good way to know before you start out. You never want to reach out to a potential funder without at least being able to say thank you for your support in the past. And so even if you're just now getting ready to start this process up, hopefully an appeal of grants will let you to find some past transactions. The other thing you could do, if you don't have an appeal for grants, if you're inheriting a database where your predecessor did not get that set up, at the very, very least, maybe what you want to do is say, I want to see a transaction where the constituent has a name. Let's do, actually, in fact, the constituent type. First, let's whittle this down so we're not looking through everybody in the database. We're only looking for organizations. So I've got 608 transactions related to organizations. Now let me whip this down a little bit further. I want transactions related to constituents where the type is organization and the name of that organization contains foundation. And now we're down to 34. Or name contains endowment. Then I picked up a few. Or name contains trust. I have a few more. So, I mean, what I'm showing you here right now is if you're just now kind of moving into this process, you've inherited a database, you're just trying to make sure that before you really dig into grant making, that you can find everything in your organization's history that was a grant, this is what I kind of recommend. And all these notes will be, you'll get all these notes. So, that's kind of backwards looking. Let's now do a little forward looking. And the next thing I want to do really quickly before we get back into Bloomerang, I mentioned this in the agenda, and I'm going to apologize if this is repeat information or this is information you already have. I kind of like to spend a minute here, 3.5 minutes maybe, talking about something outside of Bloomerang, which is some resources out there for finding prospective grantors. So for years and years and years, I've been a big believer in, a big user of the foundationcenter.org. Nonprofit organization. Foundationcenter.org recently, within the last year, merged with my favorite database of nonprofit organizations called GuideStar, And now those two organizations are both available at candid.org. Once you go into candid.org, you can search for foundation grants. I want to find grants for my nonprofit. And within that, you might want to scroll down here to Foundation Directly Online Quick Start. They'll ask you to log in and create a record. This doesn't cost any. Now, I will say, there's a free version here that you can do what I'm going to show you now for absolutely free. Or you can buy a subscription, and then you got a whole lot more powerful search engine to get to. But even if it's just for free, you can log in. And now you're able from here to either, if you've already know the name of a local foundation and you want to get some more information about them, you can just type that name in. But maybe what you want to do here is just look for every potential funder within a region. And I'm in Indianapolis, where if I did this right now, the answer to this would be thousands long. So I'm going to narrow it down a little bit and go to a smaller community elsewhere in Indiana that I'm really familiar with. So let's look now at a list of 106 grant makers in the Fort Wayne area. And what you're going to get here is a list of 106 of them showing their total assets and their total giving each year. And there's one thing you'll see here. So, foundations tend to have total assets that are often roughly 5-7%, or I should say, 10 to 20 times larger than their giving. Whereas corporations, or the private foundation that is the giving arm of a corporation, may give more in the year than it's actually holding in the bank at any given time. But these will give an idea of the volume of gifts available from these funders. And you can scroll through them all, and you can look any one of them up, and from here be able to get a sense for what they give for. And often, this one doesn't have telephone number. If we scroll back and look at another one here, often what these will also let you do, if we were to go to the Fullinger Foundation, we would see that we have actually a link to their website from which you can really dig in, get a copy of their Form 990, probably see what their schedule is, what additional documents you need from them. So, at any rate, I just wanted to take a minute. Most of you probably already familiar with this, but if not, I hope this wasn't too disconcerting. Hopefully, for some of you, this was some useful information. And like I said, this is all free. Yes, that's the free version. If you got a paid subscription, then you're actually, like I said, a much more power. What I was not able to do here in the free version, Mary, was to actually filter by, for instance, arts and culture or health. I was just able to filter geographically, and so the paid versions let you filter on a much larger number of different categories. All right, let's get back into Bloomerang and get into the real meat of what we're talking about today, and that is I'm going to show you how to use the custom fields that we set up, and we're going to take 3 imaginary grants through the process. And as you've been seeing, I've been teaching, last couple times I taught this class, we went with a rock and roll theme. We had a Beatles theme and a Rolling Stones theme and a Fleetwood Mac theme. And today I'm going to turn the amplifier up to 11 and we're going to do a Led Zeppelin theme. So today we're going to be looking for grants from the Jimmy Page Foundation, the Robert Plant Trust, and the John Paul Jones Endowment. So having set up the custom fields within Notes, if I was going to be starting with my project to build a new expansion on my museum for a history of rock and roll exhibit in this wing, I'm going to do a capital campaign. And I'm starting now to research prospective donors to that capital campaign. And so the first thing I want to do is I'm aware of the fact, I know there is such a thing as the Jimmy Page Foundation. It's time to start doing research. So I'm going to start not by creating an interaction, but by creating a new timeline note. Today, I'm going to create a note. I'm going to put in all caps. This note is always going to see that we're always going to see this capital campaign prospect in all caps is always going to be at the top of this note on 9/13. So I'm going to assign this to my prospect researcher. I'm going to have my prospect researcher go to go to every resource he can find, see if we qualify. Are we within their geographical limits? Do they give to capital? Lots of foundations will only give to program and not to bricks and mortar. So the grant field is research. The date is today. I have not yet decided how much the ask is here. So we'll just save that. And now there is a note on the Jimmy Page Foundation's record. Now I'll move on to my next potential funder, where, same thing, I'm going to create a new note on the timeline. Same date, same all caps headline. On 9/13, assigned to prospect researcher. That's fine. Where the grant status, once again, is research. All right. But I'm not going to, we've seen this. I'm not going to repeat this for every prospect here. So all I'm going to do is going to jump a little bit time into the future and say that a week later my prospect researcher comes back. And we're going to change the date on this from 9/0. So 9/20, my researcher comes back and says, we meet all the requirements. We've never seen them give a capital campaign gift of larger than $50,000. So they're probably not going to be a good prospect for $1 million league gift. But we do think that that we have evaluated them as perhaps a $50,000 donor. And now we're going to change the grant status to, the next thing we want to do is a letter of intent. So maybe our same our prospect researcher is also the person who writes the letters of inquiry. And we've, maybe at this point we're going to, just for internal purposes, we're going to say, okay, we think we're probably going to ask them for $50,000. We probably don't know yet what the proposal deadline is. Their website may say that they accept proposals twice a year, and you might be able to plug something in here, but you may not want to plug this in until you've been told, yes, you can proceed. So now we'll save this, move on ahead, and you'll see that single note, 2 separate dates on it. Really quick here, let's go to the third one. Let's look up the John Paul Jones Endowment. Create a New note here. Same thing. Today, we're creating a note that they're a capital campaign. Prospect. On 9/13, assigned to prospect research. On 9/20, our researcher came back and evaluated as a 250K prospect. Assigned to write letter of intent. And let's jump a little bit further into the future and say that, now on 10/20, and we'll change the date accordingly. Every time you open this note back up, you're going to change the date to the most current date, so it keeps moving up the category. On 10/20, we got received permission to submit a proposal by 12/1/2019. So now we would have, every time we updated this, we would have moved it from research to letter of intent. Now we've got permission to submit. We've been given permission to ask for $250,000, and we know the proposal deadline is 12/1/2019. And we probably know at this point, or we've probably been told that at this point you'd normally know that if you get your your proposals in by the 1st of December, they're going to be addressed at the December board meeting, and they've probably told you that by 1/5/2020 we'll know what. Now we don't know the award amount, but we at this point we know these things. So we'll save all those things. So we are now at one point or another in the solicitation process for these 3 grants. So now let's take a real quick look at what this lets us do. If we were to create a grant report now from scratch, not from a template, but from scratch, a note report for all notes that have a grant status of any. There's our 23. And they're in reverse chronological order. Now maybe we want to filter this down a little bit. Maybe what we want to say is only see notes that contain capital. No. Maybe all we want to see is where the grant status is. This is right now we're seeing everything, but maybe what we want to see from here is let's only look at the ones where the next step, where we're looking now for the letters of intent that are due, and we've got 4 of them. The Robert Plant Trust, and these earlier ones from other work that we've been doing. Or we want to see the ones where the next step is permission to submit. And we've got 5. And these are these are the current dates of the entities that we now need to be writing grants for, and we can add a column for proposal deadline. And now we may want to rearrange these by proposal deadline. So back this up. You do that. You put your cursor over here, and you click it once, and you put them in ascending chronological order, and you'll see I've got an old one here from 2 years ago that I have probably I mean, obviously this is all fake stuff, and I was just putting it in here as an example. I never went back and updated it, but what we can see here is that, this would tell you either that a proposal was not submitted or that it was submitted and your record wasn't updated. But essentially what we're seeing here is what you'd expect to see. This is in chronological order our proposal deadlines for the capital campaign prospects that we're working on right now. And the reason we recommend a whole idea here, well, there's two big ideas behind doing this within a single note. The field that we are sorting by, grant status, is a pick one from a list. So you can only be one. Whereas, I mean, we could do the same thing with a custom interaction field, but the problem is that once somebody has moved from permission to submit to proposal, we've not turned off the old one. So this custom field forces us to only be at one place, and every time we update it, we're turning off the old value, and we're not going to get outdated values. Yeah, Mallory has a really good question here, and yeah, that's where I would, grant category, exactly. You very much likely would want to be, having multiple different types of grants for programs versus capital going on. So, and in fact, I may have actually, I think if we went back to custom notes and showed you what we had there, yeah, I had a grant type that I've turned off, but that would be exactly what you're talking about here, Mallory. Good idea. A way for you to then be able to filter not only what grants are due this month, but what grants are due this month specific to grief support or something like that. Perfect. Great example. Okay, so that kind of shows how we recommend going through this process. Every grant that you're working on, every time you take another step, you're opening up the single existing note on their timeline, you're changing the date on it, and you are moving the status to the next step, and if possible, you are adding additional information further down. Now, if we go back to the Jimmy Page Foundation, which is the first one we did, and we open his note back up, and we'll move them to the same place. So, we'll jump a little bit into the future here and say that it's 11/1/2019 now, at which point, we skipped a step here, but we've got permission to submit a $100,000 proposal by January 15th, 2020. And at which point we would change the status to permission to submit. The proposal deadline was 1/15/2020, and they've probably told us that that'll get us in for their late January board meeting, and on February 1st we'll know whether we got the money or not. All right, so now let's presume we jump a little bit further ahead. We got this grant. Now, once you've received a grant, you need to really be keeping track of the progress in two different places. But it's useful to continue keeping this note for that same reporting purpose that we talked about. So let's say on February 2nd, we find out we got this grant. You can do this either or. You can what we're going to do now is we are both going to enter a new transaction. It's going to be a pledge, and we're going to update the note. So we're going to change the note date to 2/2/2020. At which point when we were notified that we received a 3-year, $75,000 3-year grant. Our status has been changed to awarded. We don't want to lose the fact that we asked them for $100,000, but we do need to also keep track that the award amount was $75,000. And now we've been told, so here's the deal, they're going to give us the first $25,000 almost immediately, and then it's another $25,000 each of the next 2 years. So they're expecting a progress report a year from now on 2/2/2021, and a final report on 2/2/2022. So now we have kept our note current. If we go back to the summary page, we'll see that we've changed the date to the most recent date, which is now in the future because we've been doing time traveling. But now, having updated the note, the other thing we'll do is we will actually enter this, and unless you get a letter from a funder where when you open the envelope a check falls out, you're almost always wanting to enter grants as pledges. So we would enter this as a new pledge on the date that we received it, and the day we received it was 2/2/2020. And here we would say the total amount of the grant, not the first installment, but the total amount, was $75,000. It's to our building fund as part of our capital campaign. This is gift entry. You've done this before. The appeal here was, I have, as we recommend, if you don't have this yet, make sure you do it, add a separate fund or a separate appeal for grants. They're not going to be auto-paying it. We're going to have, so they're not giving us a credit card here. We're going to have to send them a grant report, which is going to trigger the second payment. So auto-payment is none. And you may want to put some additional information in here. Including this might be where you would say something like, this gift is donor recognition for this gift includes naming rights for a classroom or something like that. That's where you would put something like this. Your first installment date of this gift is probably, in fact, if we change frequency to yearly, typically, very commonly, a grant like this is saying, we're giving you the grant, fill out the grant paperwork and submit it, and we'll give you the first installment, and then the second installment will be after you receive your first report, and the third installment will be after you receive their final report. So here we would say the first installment date may be roughly a month after we get the grant, turn around, and so once we've changed frequency to yearly, we'll change the installment amount to $25,000. We'll save this. And now we will see, if we go back to the summary page, $75,000 pledge on 2/20. We click on the pledge to look at the schedule. The next installment is in March. Click here at the schedule, and we'll see then that another $25,000 will be due in March of 2021, and another in March of 2022. These things all come in automatically once you've started to enter the pledges these ways. So maybe our next gift, when we decided to submit the Robert Plant Foundation grant, we realized capital isn't their big thing, even though I'm sure Robert Plant is just as rich as anybody from Led Zeppelin. I'm sure that maybe his giving is focused more on program than on bricks and mortar, and so it's not going to be that big a gift. And so maybe what we do here is we're going to find out, moving a little bit into the future, on we found out in November that we're allowed to submit a proposal, but for only $25,000. So and we submit that, and it comes, and so what we end up doing, finding out from him in January, on January 15th of 2020, we find out that jumping ahead here, 1/15/2020, notified of a $25,000 gift. Good news. Change the status to grant awarded. The amount was $50,000. The deadline was back in December. We found out, as told on 1/15/2020, $25,000. In this case, we're not required to submit an interim report. They're going to give us the entire grant in a single installment as soon as we fill out the grant contract, so there's no progress report due. But they want a final report a year from now. Save all that. Once again, unless we open the envelope and the check was attached, here we would call this a pledge. Came in on 1/15/2020. $25,000 to our building fund as part of our capital campaign. The appeal was grants. It's not going to be auto-paid. And the first installment's going to be as soon as we turn around the paperwork. So, maybe it's going to be 2/10/2020. Frequency, we don't have a one-time frequency. If it's a one-time gift, just use yearly, full amount. And then what we'll do is, it's now entered into the timeline as a pledge. We fill out the paperwork, the grant the acceptance policy, our promise to spend it the way they told us, and our promise to fill in to provide a final grant report a year from now. And at that point now, we would submit that. When the gift comes in, now we would enter it as a donation, and Bloomerang is going to say, is this a new donation or is this a payment on an existing pledge? And the answer is, it is an installment on an existing pledge. Create pledge payment. Again, make sure the date is correct. We're talking now about, this is early next year, because we're doing time travel. It was a $25,000 payment to the building fund, capital campaign grants. Obviously, all these things are it's inheriting the same answers to these questions that were set up by the pledge in the first place. Check date was 2/9/2020, we can say. Once we save it, now we can go to our summary page. I dated this wrong. I dated pledge. I put the wrong date in here. That was a mistake. Let me just fix that. All right, now we should see it. Now we've got the pledge on 1/15 and the payment on 2/11. And if we go back and run our reports, we can still do the same things we've always done. We can we can run our report of every note that is anywhere in the process. So grant status is any. And we'll see where we are with all of our grants, or we can say I want to see only those where the grant status is grant awarded. And we'll see our awarded grants. And maybe we can say grant status is awarded and date is since the start of this campaign. And we started this campaign in July. Then there's only R6, and then we'll see all these fabulous musicians supporting our cause. And we can add the column for grant award amount. Actually, we could ask both. We can add two of them side by side. We'll see. We asked for $5.1 million. We received $2.7 million, giving you an idea of, what our success rate is. Here's somebody gave us more than we asked for. All right. It is noon here in the Eastern Time Zone, and that completes my agenda for today. So I hope that made sense and was useful for those of you who need to get scooting on. But if anybody has other questions, sure. Well, okay, yeah. So, yeah, for anybody who'll stick around, I'm going to answer Rusty's question about a second year for a grant. And anybody else stick around. You can ask additional questions. Otherwise, I think I've covered the basic stuff, but feel free to stick around. So, yeah. So let's take a look at, as Rusty had a question. Let's go back to that Jimmy Page Foundation. So the next thing you may want to do, if we open up Jimmy's record again, we will see that grant status is awarded, but we've got a grant progress report deadline. So one thing you may want to be doing would be to be always running a report of all your notes where progress report is between today and the end of time. And here's a list of all of your upcoming progress reports, including a couple that are actually overdue. No, I'm sorry. This is the date. This is the date of the note. Let me add a column for progress report deadline. And drag this to the left and sort by it. That's more like it. So here we're seeing, here's a list of when your progress reports are due. And so this would actually be something worth saving. Save as deadlines. So then, then next year when you submit the progress report, when that date comes, if we went back to the Jimmy Page Foundation and we jump into the future and we update the timeline note to February 2nd of 2021, the interim progress report was submitted. You know what you can do. Another thing we can do here is we can attach it. This, we could have done. I should have shown you this. You can also, when you submit the grant, use attachments to submit the grant. And assuming you're actually writing these grants on the same computer that you're keeping, the same computer that you're keeping Bloomerang in, then actually all you have to do is just attach the grant, attach the grant, and then later attach the preliminary report, and they're all on the timeline note. And then you just go down here and change the final report deadline. The final report deadline, you already know what it is. We're just now we're going to also have a report, just like the one we just did, showing us all of our progress report deadline. I want a similar one showing when final reports are due. Well, okay, Rusty. So my answer here is well, on closed for Melissa's question. When this particular, actually, I think what we're saying here is the same question. When this particular final report is submitted, then this grant is closed. In the meantime, sometime next year, even though we are only a third of the way through or two-thirds of the way through our 3-year $75,000 capital campaign grant to the Jimmy Page Foundation, we found out that Jimmy really likes what he wants to do, what we're doing, and he wants to underwrite a program for us. That's the point at which you would create a whole new note for that new grant. This grant, which we start working on in about a year from now, in 9/17 of 2020, would be part of our 2021 20-year grants. Whole different a whole different. We've not even done research on this. We've been talking to Jimmy's representatives. We know he's interested, so we're actually already ready to. We've been given permission to submit a proposal by 12/1 of 2020 for our program year. Right, exactly. A new note for each different grant. And that way, because you're right, you're exactly right. With a lot of these funders, between the time you start researching and the time you write the proposal and the time you get the grant and the time you write reports, you may have 2 or 3 different grants open with them at any one time. Single report or a single note for each different grant. Perfect. Thanks, everybody. Talk to everybody later. Have a great weekend.